Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk. It's my first time in Atlanta, actually. First time at Render, and I'm loving the vibe here. Hope you are having a great time. And so today, I'll be talking about frameworks. Right? So for those of you who don't know me, I have been an independent open source developer since 2016. That's like how many years? 7 years. And I work full-time on open source projects, mostly Vue.js and Vite. How many of you here have heard of these projects? Great. Previously, I worked at Google and then Meteor, which is also an open source framework. My Twitter handle is @youYuXi. That's my Chinese name, and my GitHub handle. I don't know why I chose that, but it's hard to remember, which is good. Fewer people ping me in their messages. All right, so let's do a poll. How many of you here use Vue in your work? Okay, not that many. React? Get out of here. I'm just joking. Svelte? Anyone? Solid? Cool, all right. They got the whole crew there. All right, so you've probably been wondering, like, if you are a front-end developer, you definitely have heard of a lot of frameworks over the years. How many of you remember the to-do MVC days? Raise your hands. All right. Why are there so many damn frameworks? And just like programming languages, like, it just never stops, never ends coming, and you go on Twitter, and you always see people debating, arguing, and it's like a cycle, right? I've been seeing this since I started working with JavaScript, and it's still going on this very morning. I somehow got into a discussion, and people are still like debating whether they like templates or JSX, and I mean, we've all seen it, and some of you are probably already tired of it. But I'm here to argue that multiple frameworks coexisting is actually a good thing, okay? So first of all, the web is diverse, and I mean really diverse. And we can look at this diversity from a few different perspectives. First of all, use cases. There is an excellent article by Jason Miller, author of Preact, about application holotypes. There are so many different kind of things you can build on the web. You can build social networking sites, media players, applications, heavy load applications like Figma, Gmail, even Photoshop directly running in your browser. You can have content websites, just blog posts, news articles, filled with ads. Storefronts, you buy stuff online, and these are probably the most load performance sensitive. And there are actual games running in your browsers, right? All of these different kind of apps, they have drastically different characteristics and requirements on what they need to prioritize, whether it be loading speed, page size, or the time to interactive, or when you click the button, how fast the next thing happens. I think there's a new metrics for that, NIP or INP. And social networking, obviously the page needs to load fast, right? So if you click into that excellent article, it discusses in a lot more depth about the various constraints and priorities you should focus on when you're building different kind of apps. And outside of this, we also have developers, the human side of things, right? Developers have different roles and backgrounds. There are full-stack polyglots who work with multiple languages. They don't see themselves being confined within one specific domain. They'll just learn anything to achieve their goals. How many of you consider yourself a full-stack polyglot? Cool. And there are full-stack JS devs, right? Like some developers, including myself, I can do the full stack, but I prefer to stay within the ecosystem, one language. It just makes me comfortable. I know JavaScript, I know NPM, I know all the packages I can use in the ecosystem, and if I can stay within that, I'm happy. And there are primarily backend devs, maybe working with a completely different language than JavaScript, various, you work with Java or C# or whatever, but you still need to deal with front end occasionally, not like you want to, but sometimes you do. Then there are front-end specialists who focus on nothing but the front end, or even more specifically within the front-end specialists, there are CSS specialists, or people who focus on accessibility, different kind of topics. And there are game developers who mostly maybe coming from the traditional game industry, but somehow now their next platform is the web, so then now they have to focus on the web to build games. But they may be just dealing with WebGL and not necessarily the DOM, right? But we put all of them, group them together. They are web devs. They work on the web. They build stuff for the web. And then there are team environments. We come from, given a developer, you work in different environments. Some of us are independent, solopreneurs. All we need is something that get us from zero to product as fast as possible, right? And we don't really care that much. So I'm not specifically talking about frameworks, but if I were to build a product as a solopreneur, I don't care that much about making sure that I can having the apps fully tested, or very using design patterns, make sure everything fits together, being nicely testable and all that. My focus is get from idea to something tangible as fast as possible, to be able to validate those ideas and get it deployed on a platform with the smoothest experience as possible. And there are non-tech small businesses, right? Nowadays, every company, whatever industry you're in, you need some sort of tech presence. You need your website, maybe an app. Even if you're a restaurant, you need to have ordering platform and all that, right? But these small businesses, sometimes they don't necessarily have the capacity to have in-house developers. And even if they do, technically, a lot of cases, they have very different needs from, say, tech startups, where their whole focus is building a highly polished tech product that people would want to pay for. And then there's traditional enterprise, big companies, traditional industries, and you have this whole IT department, which don't necessarily work with the latest cutting-edge technologies, but the primary need is to making sure things are stable, solid, safe, and fits regulations. And then there's the tech enterprise companies, started as startups, but now grown big enough. They are still tech at their heart, but now they have to deal with all these different kind of constraints of a growing engineering organization. Now you have to figure out how to do things at scale, which is a completely different problem domain compared to small startups. And all of these companies, all of these team environments, they are also just grouped into this very generic term called web devs, right? So these are the contexts. If we combine all these perspectives and all these possible differentiations, you come up with such a diverse demography. Yet, when we are debating frameworks on Twitter, nobody actually talks about this stuff, right? You just see people focusing on all the surface level differences, and the context is always missing, almost, right? And you bring it up, and it just turns into a completely different discussion, okay? So this is something I've been witnessing myself, and I really hope this kind of, we as collectively as web devs, we start to recognize these diversity and differences, and be more aware of the context when we're thinking about frameworks, talking about frameworks, and comparing them. So the other side of the coin that I want to discuss is why there can't be silver bullets. I don't believe it is possible for one framework or one programming language to perfectly fit all your use cases, right? Partly because of the different backgrounds, different demographies, and different use cases that we discussed. There are different strengths. But front and foremost, we are humans, developers are humans, and we have preferences. And sometimes you don't explain preferences. And you will hold an opinion so strongly, you're willing to die on that hill, and it's still, somehow you will see people holding completely opposite side of the opinions, and both can believe them to be valid, right? So this tweet is actually from this very morning, not meant to start a debate, right? Just like Dan says. And it started with, I think it's Leah wrote saying she prefers Vue, but then someone says, no, I hate it because of the v-if and v4 and that stuff. I see it and it's make me sick. And, right? And I try to explain, right? One of the reasons Vue choose the v-if, v-for syntax is because they are attributes and they fit within the HTML syntax, which makes the whole Vue template syntax HTML compatible. So one interesting side effect of that is you can write Vue templates directly in the DOM. So you can let Vue take the HTML that's already there, take it from there, and work from there, instead of relying on a build step. Right? This is, in fact, surprisingly to many people who don't know much about Vue, this is a surprisingly common use case. On JS Deliver, the CDN, on this one CDN alone, Vue actually has more than 1 billion hits per month over the CDN. And absolute majority of those use cases are in fact using in HTML templates, which is something only possible because we stick to HTML compatible template syntax. So this is background explaining why we stick with this, why we chose the syntax to stick with the syntax. But it's not really about claiming that it's superior than JSX, right? Because after all, people have preferences. So conflicting preferences leads to different trade-offs, right? On the left, you see the JSX. This is just for people who are not familiar with the terms we're talking about here. On the left, we have JSX, which is an extension on top of JavaScript. So everything in here is, in fact, JavaScript, compiled to JavaScript. It is also close to JavaScript. All these angle bracket things are, in fact, considered as expressions. So in order to express a sort of if-else condition, a flow control in your template or in your rendered output, you have to use ternaries. So if the user is logged in, here is the start of the ternary, and this is the condition. So this is the first branch, and this is the second branch. So on the right is a Vue template that does exactly the same thing, but we're using directives, v-if and v-else, right? Developers coming from different backgrounds, or they've worked with a certain framework for long enough, have drastically different reactions when they see this. So this is React users. And this is Vue users. So you just like flip things around, and it just still holds, right? But if we dig past this sort of superficial syntax preference, at a more fundamental level, I believe, this is what I believe, is React and Vue, when you think about JSX or single file components, and I would loosely group Svelte in the same camp with Vue because we both use single file components, is that the mindset about how we're approaching web development in general, at the very high level, single file components or Vue and Svelte focus on enhancing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When you look at a file, you feel that's something you would write if you got into web development by just starting with HTML, CSS, JavaScript fundamentals. Right? It's a natural extension of what you've learned along the way. And if you're also working with other people with the same background, you're working with people who primarily focus on designing CSS, you're working with someone primarily focused on HTML accessibility and semantics, right? It feels very natural to fit these things together. On the other hand, when we think about React, React is a more JS-first, JS-centric mindset. And in fact, I would describe it as a programming model that just happens to target HTML, CSS, JavaScript, right? And it's true because you do have abstractions like React Native, which abstracts away the platform. In fact, React itself is split into React and React DOM because React Core is framework agnostic, is platform agnostic, right? React Core is a programming model that is designed with this in mind. It is meant to be targeting multiple platforms. And that comes with the trade-offs, right? The cool part about it is it's straightforward to make React target different platforms. You get React Native, you get React 3.js integrations. But on the other hand, it also causes certain concepts to leak between this. And one of the examples, in my opinion, okay, don't hate me on this, is I think hooks is shoehorning algebraic effects into JavaScript, a host language that it just isn't best suited to express those ideas. So while there are cool ideas coming out of React hooks, right, we also kind of have to suffer through some paper cuts in development experience, like because it repeatedly calls things, you now have to remember to use callback, use memo, and all that, right? So at certain spots, when you are trying to have a program model that abstracts over a lower level platform that have fundamental differences with your desired ideal model, there can be leaks, which can eventually leak into the daily development experience. Right? So these are trade-offs. I'm not here to debate which one is the right way, because I believe there is no right way. Right? And then there are many other technical implementations we can sort of compare. You have virtual DOM versus compilers. Some people love virtual DOM, even without JSX. They just love the feeling of able to have full control over the render structure, thinking about your render outputs as a tree of JavaScript objects that you can look at and reflect on and all that. But at the same time, right, we also have the other camp where we prefer compilers to be able to take your templates, compiling, or Solid.js can take your JSX and compile into something that just has nothing to do with virtual DOM, have lower memory cost and have better performance in many cases, right? So there are trade-offs, and there are hooks versus fine-grained reactivity. I'll talk about the connection between them a bit later on, but obviously there are people who prefer fine-grained reactivity. There are people who prefer hooks. And from what I've learned, I believe the design hooks also has something to do with the fact that because hooks hides away the mutability inside React's implementation layer, which gives it more room for it to implement features like concurrent and use transition. So there are some design decisions that leads back to the bigger picture that React wants to achieve. But at the surface level, when people are not necessarily using those features, fine-grained reactivity solves a lot of the paper cuts and pain points of using hooks on a daily basis. And then there's CSS in JS and single-file component scoped CSS. CSS in JS is, again, a manifestation of the idea of JS first and treating HTML CSS sort of the implementation details, try to abstract over it. There are also nice things of being able to combine CSS with your dynamic JavaScript state. At the same time, scoped CSS feels like you're just writing script tags inside an HTML file, and it's not automatically scoped to your current component. Right? There are different preferences and technical trade-offs in here, or thanks to Tailwind, both camps can just switch to Tailwind if they want. And then there are people who hate Tailwind, right? So all of these comparisons, I'm not trying to say which one is superior, right? We're looking at these as all the possible things people can debate, and sometimes we get lost in the big picture. So another aspect of why I believe it's hard for one framework, even if it continues to evolve, to cover all the possible cases, right? We'll ask, like, why isn't it possible for this one framework to just keep improving itself and eventually being able to just fix all its problems and be the perfect silver bullet for everyone? So here's one thing, the term that I coined. I call it the chosen path inertia. So frameworks start to attract users due to its special characteristics. It attracts a group of initial users that aligns with its initial characteristics. Okay? And when you grow beyond a certain threshold, there starts to be the framework's evolution direction starts to be constrained by the preference of its existing users. So when you propose radical changes, there will be resistance from your existing user base. And we've experienced firsthand with Vue when we proposed Composition API. Many Vue users who fell in love with Vue because of Options API, and when they saw something so drastically different, their natural reaction is to say, I don't want to use it, right? It's very common for this to happen, and I think React Hooks did a much better job at evangelizing and convincing its community in its transition. But we are now seeing another wave of sort of community resistance when it comes to React Server components. There are doubts and concerns, right? So I have great respect for the React team to be willing to try out crazy ideas like this, given their the huge amount of users they already have. So they have to fight against this inertia. They have to fight, it's an uphill battle of trying to convince your existing users who are not necessarily aligned with the new things you want to try. And it's a constant challenge. So it's going to be hard for you to diverge from a chosen path because you're sort of pushed towards by your existing users into that path. And the more widely adopted, the stronger the inertia. So in a way, this is why oftentimes you will see new languages, new frameworks popping up, because existing frameworks have a much harder time coming up with radically different ideas or implementations. This is why you can, every once in a while, you'll have a new framework that comes up with this new thing. For example, Svelte coming up with this compilation-based reactivity, right? So we tried to do similar things in Vue, but we found that it just conflicts with a lot of things that's ingrained in our user base. It conflicts with certain habits and ecosystem patterns, be it preference, be it use cases reported from, so we shipped some similar features called reactivity transform. We tested in the wild and noticed that it just doesn't fit the Vue community. It doesn't fit the Vue use case. So eventually we decided to drop it, right? So my point here is that the more established a framework is, the more difficult it is to reinvent itself. And you can do that, but your wiggle room just naturally shrinks as you get more solidified by your existing user base. So we're seeing a similar thing in the recent Angular 16 discussion when Angular proposes to switch to propose single file standalone components and signals. And because signals allows Angular to get rid of Zone.js, some users are concerned that signals is making Angular losing its identity. It just no longer looks like Angular. And that's the reason, so they're saying you're taking away the reason for me to love this framework, right? So it's very common for things like that to happen, which is why there are always opportunities for new frameworks to iteratively improve upon existing models because they're not constrained by this. Okay, plus all of that technical side of things, there are more decision criteria we need to consider when we're picking frameworks, right? There are the tooling, developer experience, learning curve. Learning curve is highly relevant based on where you're starting from. Are you an experienced developer? Are you new into development? Are you coming from did you get into development through web, or did you come into development through another background, for example, backend Java or game development? And there's the ecosystem. This is a very commonly raised thing. This is something you can only build through time, and there's community. Certain frameworks, attract people with certain characteristics, so there are different vibes. And then there's the job demand, which again is dictated by the way these frameworks are being adopted in the wild. And there's maturity and long-term stability, right? So these criteria, when we are looking at them, they're also weighted differently based on who you are, what your needs are, what company, what team environment, what kind of background you have, right? If, say, given the solopreneur situation, I really don't care that much about job demand, right? But if you're just getting new into web development, and your sole purpose of learning web development is to get a job, then this is like the #1 thing you need to consider. So drastically different priorities based on your different backgrounds. So combined with all these different, so you can think of the decision matrix being these different criteria being listed out there, and for every single person or company picking a framework, they have different weights placed on these criteria. So it is also very difficult for a single framework to optimize for all these different cases, right? So the best we can do is to focus. So personally, what we're doing is to focus on our existing users, making sure we serve them well. So going back to the big picture, I believe multiple frameworks is good because at the very high level, it provides us with an optimal productivity coverage, right? All these things I talked about, I argued about, is to make the point that different developers will find different frameworks that gives them maximum productivity, okay? So if we accept that as a fact and we consider all these circles of these developer groups with different priorities and needs and decision criteria, right? And you want to throw a dart that is shared by all these different groups, it's almost impossible, right? So you do need multiple frameworks to cover these different circles. And if you think about this big circle here as the whole web dev population, right? And to think about optimizing at big picture level, we want all of them to be productive. If there are only one solution at the center, then a lot of them outside the sweet spot or the happy place, happy path. So developers falling outside of that circle, they essentially have to suffer because they are not, their preferences, their needs are not necessarily 100% aligned with the framework, the only solution that is available. So, and if you're familiar, you probably can see some colors here. It's kind of like a metaphor. It's not completely accurate, but I do believe that multiple different frameworks being more focused on their dedicated user group, serving them well, and together, overall, we achieve better efficiency, better optimal allocation of resources overall. So it's a net positive for the entire web ecosystem. Okay, side note, when you see the title, you probably think about, shouldn't we just all use web components? So my personal take is that web components are great for interop. There are great use cases for it. It does solve the problem of sharing components across multiple frameworks. But it's not a complete solution because the standards themselves do not really cover how to efficiently render things, how to manage reactive state, how to do logical use and state management, and more importantly, how do you do integrated end-to-end server-side rendering. So there are a lot of things, the void that needs to be filled by frameworks, and if you build these yourselves on top of web components, you're essentially building your in-house self-created framework that you need to maintain yourself and losing out on the community upside of the more established frameworks. So, so instead of one thing to rule it all, which you might tend to want to see that happen if you're deeply invested in one framework, I still think it's great to celebrate the diversity of the web, right? Despite myself being, the author of the framework, one of the frameworks, obviously I want to see the framework grow and succeed, but still, I acknowledge that it's impossible for me to make everyone happy. And it's great to see other solutions exist to make people who don't like Vue happy, okay? And I think, in general, I want to see us just embrace a more open mindset. Instead of, when we think about frameworks, it's less about us versus them. Try to, acknowledge and see the shining spots in other solutions and learn from them. And more exchange of ideas. Also, when you have the urge to debate someone on Twitter, think about the context. Are we focused on the same problem? Are we coming from the same background? Or even, are we building the same thing, right? Debating template syntax with someone else on Twitter, sometimes it just feels like debating apples versus oranges when you're not even sure if it's an herbivore or a carnivore. So, also, one important thing is, I think there should be more extraction of framework-agnostic value. So, before we get into that, the ideal situation that we want to see is healthy competition with cross-pollination, right? And I think it already has been happening, and it has been constantly happening. And here, what I want to do is just to highlight that. If for developers who've been working with a single framework for an extended time, it's very common for you to be so deeply invested into a single ecosystem and just not be aware of what's going on outside. So here's some interesting history. When React hooks first came out, this is back in 2018, this is kind of like a half-joke tweet that I said, okay, we can do Vue hooks, which ended up becoming composition API. And then Rich Harris replies to this tweet saying, we can do this in Svelte too. And then a few hours later, he came up with this. So if you think about it, React hooks, in fact, directly inspired View Composition API and Svelte 3. Okay? If you've used Svelte 2, you know Svelte is something completely different before it became Svelte 3. Svelte 3 is the stage where it started to become this compiler-based reactivity framework. And Svelte 2 is mostly runtime reactivity. And obviously, React also influences Solid and Quick. Both uses JSX. And although they both use fine-grained reactivity, similar to View Composition API, the syntax and component authoring format is no doubt heavily influenced by React. Right? And then the way that Svelte 3 handles the collocation of template and state, the fact that you can just declare something in your script block and access directly in your template expressions. This is something that inspired the View script setup syntax, which allows you to do the same thing with View Composition API. And I believe Astral is also more or less affected by, inspired by this. You know, the core idea here is collocating state and your template. And then inside the fine-grained reactivity paradigm, there's a lot of history and cross-pollination. And we can see that back in 2009, how many of you have used Knockout here? Right? If you've used Knockout and you see Solid.js today, you'll notice that the fine-grained reactivity nature of it feels very similar. And in fact, this paradigm has long existed in front end. And Meteor Tracker. Meteor is this full-stack JavaScript framework I used to work on. And it also has this fine-grained reactivity tracking system called Tracker. They fall inside the same paradigm because they all do the same thing. So you have, when you say render a component, it's considered an effect. And during the rendering of the component, it automatically tracks every piece of state it has used. And later on, when those pieces of state are mutated, it triggers the effect or the component to render again. So, so this is what we generally consider fine-grained reactivity. And Vue started with this model underneath. But in the beginning, we decided to hide this detail because we feel a plain object-based syntax is more friendly to beginners. Right? And that was the initial focus of the Vue Options API. We essentially implemented fine-grained reactivity, but hid it behind this sort of opaque object model so that you don't need to even think about it. But later on, when React Host came out, we noticed that exposing the lower-level primitives, in fact, unlocks this kind of composition capability that allows you to just easily refactor, move, and extract logic, move them outside your component, and extract them into reusable utilities. Right? So at the fundamental level, View Composition API, exposing the primitives hidden behind Options API, and turn it into something really similar to Solid Signals. Right? And Solid Signals and View Composition API together influenced an explosion of new Signals-style APIs that you see in pre-act signals. So quick stores and signals are also influenced by both Solid and Composition API. And Angular signals, which is recently, I believe it's released in Angular 16, is also, in its RFC, describes that it's being influenced by Vue, Solid, and Preact. So we're seeing a pretty healthy sort of history of solutions building on top of old ones and improving and making different design trade-offs. Right? We're not going to dig into the detailed differences here, but the general idea is these different implementations, while building on the commonly shared primitives, are in fact catering to different preferences and needs of their specific user groups. And then Ember, in fact, also is kind of falling to the same camp. Ember Objects has dependency tracking, and Yehuda has lately been abstracting it into a standalone library called Starbeam, which again falls into the same fine-grained reactivity, lower-level primitives camp. So a lot of interesting things happening in this space, and they're influencing one another. And I believe that's for the greater good of the general development experience. And then the frameworks, meta framework space, right? On top of just the client libraries, we have all these meta frameworks that are full stack JavaScript, Next.js, Nuxt, Remix, SvelteKit, Astral. And you can, if you've used more than one of these, you notice a lot of shared paradigms like file-based routing, static generation, hybrid rendering, being able to SSR and static generate in the same app. There are various data fetching patterns that have different kind of trade-offs. Isomorphic component trees like React Server components, and you can also see that being experimented in different ways. And there are, not to mention in Quick, there's also this, this new trend of relying on your compilers to essentially, even in your method callbacks, you can directly call server-side code, and the compiler will automatically split it out. So in server components, you can also use server, right? So the boundary between server and client is being sort of squashed. And there's a lot of innovation and cross-pollination happening in this space, and it's exciting to watch. But there's also a phase where we need to kind of patiently wait a little bit to see whether they actually end up being a sort of emerging a new convention. So I think this is an exciting phase, and I'm also personally keeping an eager eye on this. But let's talk about something we've already done. Like I've tried to do this, and this is something I hope more people can do, is trying to extract framework-agnostic value when you recognize them. So as library authors and framework implementers, we work on a lot of problems. In fact, there's a lot of reinventing the wheels across different framework camps. It's very common, right? Remember the days when every framework sort of have its own boilerplate with different build tools, or even if you're based on Webpack, you have drastically different conventions of Webpack plugins and loaders that you need to use to get a framework running, right? If you want to share things between a Create React app and a Vue CLI app, it's almost impossible because both abstracts away the lower level configurations so deep, it's like average developers can't just figure out how to dig into those, right? So one of the things I'm really proud of personally is Vite. Vite started out as a Vue-specific dev server. How many of you here have used Vite? Great. If you were not familiar with the history of Vite, it started out as something Vue-specific. My first attempt at building something similar to Vite was the only goal for me was to get Vue single file components over a native ESM import. And once I got that working, it suddenly dawned on me, this whole requesting something with native ESM and transpiling it on the fly and sending JavaScript back, in fact, does not have to be restricted to Vue itself. It can work on Svelte files, JSX files, TS files, or even CSS files, right? So I redesigned Vite halfway to make it framework agnostic. And that's probably one of the best decisions I've made in my development career, because now we are seeing Vite being used as a shared build tool layer across multiple different frameworks, right? We use it in Vue and Nuxt. Svelte uses it in SvelteKit. Solid uses it in Solid Start. Quick uses Vite under the hood. Astral uses Vite under the hood. And because of the framework agnostic nature of it, you can also see people running React, Vue, Svelte in the same project when you're using something like Astral. And you almost get that for free when you're using Vite because of the simplified first-party integrations coming from all these frameworks. Another exciting example is the UnJS. This is probably lesser known, but I think it's a great initiative. If you search for UnJS, they actually started as internal components, internal utilities for Nuxt 3. So when the Nuxt team was working on Nuxt 3, they noticed that they are building a lot of these lower-level parts that have higher value, that have more value other than just being a part of Nuxt. So they abstract these out into an organization called UnJS, and it grew into a collection of framework-agnostic tools. I think the most important one among these is probably Nitro. It's a server. It's a high-level abstraction for you to build JavaScript-based servers You can build as if you're just using Node.js, but it abstracts away the provider layer. So when you build something with Nitro, you can deploy it almost anywhere. So they have providers for almost any platform you can think of, including all the edge work like Cloudflare Workers, Amazon Lambdas. So you can move between these providers with ease. And that is being used underneath Nuxt, so Nuxt get the same capability. And there is unplugging, because we have all these different build tools, Rollup, Vite plugin format builds on top of Rollup, but it's slightly different, and we have Webpack, we have Parcel. So unplugging is essentially an attempt to have a normalization layer where you write your plugin for once, and unplugging will make it compatible with multiple different bundlers. So this has resulted in us being able to, say, write a lot of code transformation tools, and we write it once, and it works with both Vite and Webpack, which has been greatly useful for us. And there are Unbuild, which is a opinionated bundling tool. So one of the pain points that we currently have is if you write a library in TypeScript, and you want to ship it with the right distribution files, right types, and right package formats, it's a quite challenging feat. So Unbuild tries to give you this opinionated best practice so that you can just build from your TypeScript source files and follow the packaging format, and you're done. So there are more things inside the UnJS collection that you can check out, and it's really a treasure trove. And then another example is the Volar.js initiative. So Vue single file components, when we first came up with the idea, to be completely honest, we didn't think about IDE support at all. And mostly because it looked just like HTML. So the syntax highlighting kind of works, and we were happy about it. But later on, as we added more and more features, we needed dedicated support. And in particular, we need IntelliSense for TypeScript embedded inside the Vue files. We had to go through a few iterations of different designs to find an efficient and performant implementation for our Vue extension. And eventually, again, we realized there are more such use cases outside of Vue single file components. For example, Astral files also need to deal with JavaScript IntelliSense inside an embedded format. So you also have you also have other file extensions that potentially need to embed other languages. It's a very common case when you're trying to invent your own DSL. So we extracted the common parts inside our extension and moved it into a framework-agnostic collection of tools called Volar.js, and it is allows you to easily and quickly build IDE support for file formats that embeds other languages. So there's an ongoing collaboration with Astro team members, and not only is this for VS Code, because it works over language server protocol, so technically you can build something that supports any IDE that supports LSP. And outside of the Vue ecosystem, there are also great examples. TanStack is something I'm really happy to see because it started as React specific, but its author, Tanner Lindsay, realized that there are great potential outside of just supporting React, right? So React query, the core gets extracted into a standalone thing, and then we can build adapters on top of them so that the same fetching and caching and all that logic can be reused across multiple frameworks. So we have Vue query, Svelte query, I believe, Solid query. And it grew into a collection of cross-framework utilities. I believe there are also TanStack Table, TanStack Virtual, which can, in theory, work across multiple frameworks. And there are more great examples in the wild. Say, Shoelace is a great web component library that you can use in any framework. There are, say, Ionic. They built their core components using web components, which made it easy for them to support Vue, React, and Angular at the same time. Or you can just use raw web components. Right? So these are all great examples. And as a community, as the bigger web dev community, I believe we should build more of these. And I hope to see that happen after this talk in the future. It's already happening, but I want to see more of that. Thank you very much.